Hello, and welcome to our training on housing quality standards. My name is Ebony Farrell, and I am a compliance coordinator with Strategies to End Homelessness. This training is intended for people who either complete housing quality inspections or supervise those people, or anyone else who has knowledge regarding the quality of a housing unit assisted with CoC Program funds. These requirements are complex, and we want to make sure that everyone understands the content of this training because these standards are incredibly important to the well-being of the participants in this program. One thing we do want to note up front is that this training is focused on the regulatory requirements and the community HQS policy. We are not case managers, so questions around ensuring compliance with challenging participants are best addressed with your peers and the work groups. Our hope in providing this training virtually is that it will offer a better opportunity for the community to access and attend the training on their own time and with less trouble. We anticipate this presentation taking about 45 minutes. By the time you leave this presentation, you should understand what HQS is and to whom it applies, understand why it is necessary we have an HQS policy, learn about some of the common HQS issues both Strategies and HUD have seen during monitoring visits, feel familiar with the community HQS policy, including the acceptability requirements defined in the HQS regulations, and most importantly, you should feel prepared to take this information back to your agency and implement this community policy if you haven't already done so. 24 CFR 578.75B. This is the CoC Program regulation that addresses which programs are required to meet housing quality standards. We can see here that it is housing leased with CoC funds or for which rental assistance payments are made. So if you either have a leasing or rental assistance line in your CoC funded program, all of the housing units must meet housing quality standards. Rental assistance is either a site-based or tenant-based housing program where the participant enters into a lease with the landlord. Leasing can either be site-based or scattered site, where the agency leases the building or unit and then subleases to the participant. Although the lead-based paint requirements apply to site-based projects funded with the operating line, most of the other requirements do not apply. Please note that this training does not cover operating projects. Why have an HQS policy? First, we're required to have written policies and procedures that ensure you are operating in compliance with the Continuum of Care program. HQS is complicated, and learning these requirements takes a lot of time. With a strong and clear policy in place, persons responsible for ensuring housing quality standards are met will have a quick reference for how to handle difficult situations. During the community CoC monitoring in September of 2021, HUD found similar issues with HQS reports during their review that Strategies has seen over the years. For example, we saw a lot of inspection forms that were not filled out completely or accurately. Examples include no unit number or the wrong unit number being listed, lead-based paint sections not being filled out, the unit size not filled out, the summary decision on page 2 not marked pass or fail, the form not dated, and applicable sections not completed. We have also seen files where the unit was not inspected annually or was inspected late. We have seen units pass inspection where there were deficiencies noted that should have caused the unit to fail. For example, the stove not working or the smoke detector needing batteries. We have seen instances where an inspection documented deficiencies and appropriate follow-up did not occur or was not documented. HUD reminds us every time they talk about their documentation standards that if it is not documented, it did not happen. We have also observed in participant records instances where issues are identified off-cycle, such as during home visits and from participant complaints, and were not addressed. These are some real consequences in our community that resulted from agencies' failure to ensure that housing quality standards were met. We have seen clients enter housing that failed HQS and then have to move right back out when issues are not resolved. Landlords have filed lawsuits against agencies and participants when failed items are not being addressed. We've had complaints filed with HUD for units that continued to receive HUD funding when housing was substandard. A unit was burglarized due to windows that could not be secured. We have seen units with no heat in winter. We have seen young children living in units with deteriorated lead-based paint. We saw a child hospitalized because of insect bites in an infested unit where the parent had called several times requesting help about the infestation. These were all as a result of issues that the housing providers knew about and simply did not deal with. The Community HQS policy identifies several categories of inspections. Initial and annual are probably what you are most familiar with. Initial inspections must be completed prior to any security deposit or rental payment being made. Annual inspections must be completed within 365 days of the most recent complete inspection. Complaint inspections happen as a result of complaints made by anyone who has knowledge of the condition of a unit. Most commonly, it is the participant or landlord, but it could also be a neighbor, police officer, other housing program staff, or any person who has a reason to believe that the unit is substandard. Quality control inspections are not required, but this is the type of inspection you might complete to evaluate your HQS program. Move-out and vacate inspections are also not required, but might be completed in order to verify that the participant is no longer in the unit or to verify damages allegedly caused by the participant. Starting on page 4, the policy outlines what to do if a unit fails or the inspection is inconclusive. If this happens, you need to notify the landlord and the participant in writing of the necessary repairs and a deadline by which they must be completed. Non-emergency repairs must be made within 30 days of the initial failed inspection. Rental payments must not be issued for any unit not in compliance with HQS 30 days after the initial failed inspection, and your agency should have internal controls that prevent payments from being made to failed units. If the condition of the unit endangers the inhabitant's health or safety, an emergency repair must be made within 24 hours. Emergency repair items will be discussed later in the presentation. It is your responsibility to verify that all fail items, even minor issues, have been corrected. Usually, you must conduct an on-site reinspection. In certain circumstances, you may opt not to do an on-site reinspection and instead obtain a statement signed by the participant and the landlord certifying that repairs have been made. This would be acceptable in instances where 3 or fewer minor repairs have been completed, or if the repairs can be verified by a completed work order, subject to the scrutiny of agency staff. An example of a minor repair would be a slowly dripping faucet that is not causing water damage. Re-inspections must occur soon after the deadline for repair and no more than 30 days after the failed inspection, and must continue until you have verified that the repairs have been made and the unit meets standards. All efforts to verify repairs must be documented in the participant records. Unless expressly stipulated in the lease, the participant is responsible for certain HQS violations. This includes participant-paid utilities not being in service, lack of or poorly maintained participant-supplied appliances, damage to the unit beyond normal wear and tear, and a dead battery or no battery in a smoke detector at annual inspection. All other HQS deficiencies are considered the landlord's responsibility. If a unit fails reinspection, or if you are unable to confirm within 30 days of the failed inspection that the unit meets standards, you should begin working with the participant to identify other acceptable housing. Landlords should be informed of their responsibility to pass an initial HQS and to maintain units in compliance with HQS before entering into a lease. The same time standards for repairs apply when the HQS violations are the responsibility of the participant. The participant must be required to make non-emergency repairs within 30 days. Emergency violations such as utility shutoffs or no batteries in smoke detectors must be corrected within 24 hours. It may be necessary to adjust supportive services to work with the participant to prevent further damages. So now we'll move on to cover acceptability criteria. It is really important to remember that the annual and initial inspections are a tool for ensuring that the unit meets standards throughout the duration of the participant's tenancy. Simply completing the form does not satisfy HUD's requirements. This is something that should be on the housing specialist or case manager's radar year-round. Any issues identified throughout the year should be addressed within the same time frame as those identified in the annual and initial inspections. The acceptability criteria start on page 6 of the policy and are straight from the regulations, with the exception of the footnotes. You may consider requiring higher standards than this, but you may not allow lower. There are 13 key factors addressed in the standards. All of them apply to the housing units in your program. We can go over the basics of these requirements, but anybody who is completing inspections should be well versed and should refer back to the regulations whenever there is any doubt on what is required. Sanitary facilities. The bathroom must be a separate private room. There must be a sink, flushing toilet, and a shower or bathtub, all in proper operating condition. The sink and shower or bathtub must have hot and cold water, so you will need to run it and check that the water heater works. It is under interior air quality in the regulations, but the bathroom must have one openable window or other adequate exhaust ventilation. Food preparation and refuse disposal. The unit must have suitable space and equipment to store, prepare, serve, and dispose of food in a sanitary manner. This includes having an oven and a stove and a refrigerator of appropriate size for the family. All of the equipment must be in proper operating condition. The equipment may be supplied by either the owner or the participant. If the participant is supplying the cooking equipment, they may substitute a microwave for the oven and stove. If the owner is supplying the cooking equipment, they may only substitute a microwave for the oven and stove if the participant agrees, and this substitution is made to both subsidized and unsubsidized participants living in the building or premises. The kitchen must have a sink in proper operating condition, including hot and cold running water, a sink trap, and proper draining. Space and security. At a minimum, the unit must have a living room, a kitchen area, and a bathroom. The unit must have at least one sleeping room for each 2 persons. Children of opposite sex, other than very young children, may not be required to occupy the same sleeping room. There is guidance on the unit size attached to the HQS policy that can assist in determining whether the unit is of an appropriate size for the household composition. It is important to note that not all sleeping rooms must be bedrooms. A dining room, study, or living room can be designated as a sleeping room. A kitchen or bathroom cannot be designated as a sleeping room. The inspection form that will be discussed in a few minutes has separate spots for the number of bedrooms and the number of sleeping rooms. The number of bedrooms is what you will use for checking rent reasonableness, and the number of sleeping rooms is what you will check for sufficient space required by HQS. Windows that are accessible from the outside, such as basement, first floor, and fire escape windows must be lockable. Windows that are nailed shut are acceptable only if the windows are not needed for ventilation or as an alternate exit in the case of fire. The exterior doors must be lockable. Thermal environment. There must be a safe and functioning system for heating the unit and a safe cooling system where present. The heating system must be capable of delivering enough heat to maintain a temperature of 70 degrees Fahrenheit when the outside temperature drops below 55 degrees during the heating period. Obviously, you're not going to check the heat in the summertime, but there should not be any evidence that the furnace is inoperable. Each bedroom must have a direct heat source. Unvented room gas heaters are not acceptable, and portable space heaters do not qualify as a source of heat. Illumination and electricity. Different rooms have different requirements for windows, light fixtures, and electrical outlets. You can refer to the regulations for detail on what is required for each room type. Structure and materials. There should be no evidence of structural deficiencies or damage. For example, bulging walls, holes, water stains, leaning, buckling, or sagging. Also, if there is an elevator, it must be in proper operating condition. Interior and exterior stairs, halls, porches, and walkways must not contain tripping hazards, such as broken or missing steps. Interior air quality. The unit must be free from harmful pollutants. There must be adequate circulation, and as we mentioned before, there are requirements about windows in this section too. Water supply. There must be running water that is free from contamination. Lead-based paint. You must complete the lead-based paint visual assessment for all units other than zero-bedroom units that were built before 1978, regardless of household composition. To complete the visual assessment, the inspector examines the condition of the painted surfaces on the property and documents if there is evidence of deteriorated paint that exceeds the HUD de minimis or minimum levels. The HUD de minimis levels are calculated differently for interior and exterior paint. A visual assessment does not determine the presence of or absence of lead. In order to ensure that the visual assessment accurately assesses and documents the paint condition, all persons completing HQS inspections must complete the HUD lead-based paint visual assessment training course and retain the resulting certificate of completion as documentation of compliance with this requirement. This is a short but informative online training available on HUD's website. Please note that while it is important to be aware of the exemptions, it is very likely that most units will not call for an exemption. Please also note that although a participant may be classified as disabled, this does not mean that their housing qualifies for an exemption. The housing or residential property must be specifically designated for persons with disabilities to qualify for the exemption. If a qualified inspector has found that a property is free of lead-based paint and there is documentation to support this finding, the property is exempt from further requirements. The visual assessment is not a chemical test to confirm the presence of lead. The visual assessment consists of looking at the condition of the paint and the presence of dust and debris in the unit. The visual assessment also looks to determine if previous actions taken to control hazards are still in place. For example, if 18 years ago, lead paint was covered with a covering of drywall, the visual assessment needs to examine if the drywall is still intact. A risk assessment is conducted by a trained and certified inspector using chemical testing to identify the presence of lead-based paint. The risk assessment is a formal identification of hazards that are created by lead being present in the paint, dust, and debris. Clearance is an inspection that uses both the visual examination and chemical testing to evaluate if all of the lead-based paint hazards have been addressed. These key steps apply to all rental units built prior to 1978. Disclosure: a lead-based paint pamphlet, which includes information regarding how to protect against lead in the home, as well as a lead disclosure form, must be provided to every participant. The pamphlet and the disclosure form must be signed by the participant. Any knowledge regarding the property's lead testing, repair, hazard remediation, or clearance must be shared with the participant. Evaluations are carried out to determine if the paint is intact or if work is necessary to reduce hazards. Hazard reduction actions are carried out when a hazard has been identified. When work repairs to address the hazard have been completed, the work must pass clearance by passing the visual assessment and chemical testing. Participants and owners must be notified of all actions taken to identify lead-based paint and to address the lead-based paint hazards. In some cases, HUD may also be notified. Ongoing maintenance must take place to ensure that the repairs remain intact. Please note that all records pertaining to CoC funds must be retained for a minimum of 5 years. Participants must be given a copy of the lead-based paint pamphlet. Participants must also sign a form confirming that they received a copy of the pamphlet. This is one of the documents that the Strategies Compliance Team looks for in the participant records during the annual monitoring. The pamphlet advises the participant on identifying and controlling lead-based paint hazards. The form on this slide is the only form that will be accepted as the lead-based paint disclosure form. This form can be found at the link provided on this slide. Please make sure that you are using this specific disclosure form, as this is the only form that will satisfy HUD's requirement. The landlord must complete sections A and B by placing a check mark next to line 1 or 2 as applicable in each section. The participant must initial sections C and D. The landlord and the participant must sign and date the appropriate line at the bottom of the disclosure form to certify the accuracy of the document. It is not acceptable for the landlord and the participant to sign different copies, as doing so would not document that the participant received the information that the landlord disclosed in the landlord disclosure section. Failure to have this form in your file is a federal violation. Subrecipients, participants, and landlords should have a completed and signed copy of this form in their files. Visual assessments must be completed by your agency staff. To be qualified to complete the visual assessment, the visual assessor must go online to the link provided on this slide to complete the required training and print the certificate of completion. A copy of the certificate must be provided to Strategies. In addition to the training found at the previously mentioned web link, any agency staff responsible for conducting or supervising visual assessments must complete this Strategies provided HQS and lead-based paint training. The HUD.gov training and the Strategies training are required prior to staff members carrying out visual assessments. So we'll now move back to the rest of the acceptability criteria. Access. The unit must be accessible without unauthorized use of other private properties. There also needs to be a fire exit in addition to the primary exit. Site and neighborhood. Regulations require that the neighborhood be reasonably free from disturbing noises and reverberations and other dangers to the health, safety, and general welfare of the occupants. Take a look around and assess whether the neighborhood is a safe place for this participant or family to live. Sanitary condition. The unit and the equipment needs to be sanitary, including free from vermin and rodent infestation. Smoke detectors. Make sure that there is at least one battery-operated or hardwired smoke detector in proper operating condition on each level of the unit, including basements, but not crawl spaces and unfinished attics. If the unit is occupied by any hearing-impaired person, smoke detectors must have an alarm system designed for hearing-impaired persons. Smoke detectors must be installed in accordance with and meet the requirements of the National Fire Protection Association standard. NFPA 72 covers minimum performance, location, mounting, testing, and maintenance requirements of fire detectors. If the smoke detectors appear to be typical in design, installation appears to be done correctly in terms of mounting and wiring, they are located in all of the areas I just mentioned, and the smoke detector works, it probably meets NFPA standards. If you run into a system that looks unusual, you should refer to NFPA 72 to ensure that it meets requirements. In addition to the federal regulations, local regulations apply, including an ordinance passed by the Cincinnati City Council that requires a photoelectric smoke detector outside of any sleeping area in all rental properties. The form doesn't include this level of detail, so when we monitor, we probably won't see whether the smoke detectors are photoelectric or ionic, but you should be aware of this requirement. City enforcement of this ordinance is complaint-based, and if units are found to be out of compliance, that could impact your participants. Photoelectric and ionic smoke detectors look the same, but if you look at the back of the smoke detector, it will say which it is. There are also dual sensor smoke detectors that are both photoelectric and ionic. Now we will address emergency repair items. As explained on page 9 of the community policy, emergency repair items are deficiencies that present an immediate risk to the inhabitants' health or safety. Items of an emergency nature that must be corrected by the landlord or the participant, whoever is responsible, within 24 hours of notice by the housing provider include, but are not limited to, sewage backup, utilities not being on, the smoke detector is missing, damaged, or missing a battery, electrical outlets and light switch covers that are missing, GFCI outlets that do not function properly, circuit breaker boxes with open slot or open knockout hole, junction boxes missing a cover or open knockouts, gas stoves that do not light from the pilot, improper flue connection for a furnace or water heater, no heat when the outside temperature is below 40 degrees, flooding, and inability to secure the unit, such as missing windows or broken entry doors. You should issue a written notification that identifies all emergency fail items. The landlord or the participant must make the repair and provide confirmation within 24 hours that the emergency items have been repaired. You should document receipt of any verbal confirmation of repairs in the participant file. You must verify all emergency repairs by completing a re-inspection. If the subsequent inspection indicates that the repairs were not completed, you should begin working with the participant to identify other acceptable housing in the event that repairs are not made. Now we'll move on to the HQS inspection documentation. HUD has two inspection documents. The 52580 is an inspection checklist. 52580A is an inspection form. They both require inspection of the same areas of the unit, but the form provides instructions and more detail on the specific criteria you are looking for. In the policy, we specified the form as the required tool to use to help ensure that the person conducting the inspection understands the requirements for each area. If the 52580A does not meet all of your agency's needs, you may submit an alternative form for strategies approval. The 52580 checklist is not acceptable, nor is any other form that has not been approved by strategies. It is important to complete the form thoroughly, including the attributes of the unit, not only the condition. This includes the year of construction, which must be filled in on the second page, as there are important lead-based paint requirements for all units built before 1978. The 52580A form consists of 8 sections. For example, Section 1 is for the living room, Section 2 is the kitchen, Section 3 is the bathroom, Section 4 is for other rooms used for living and halls. At the beginning of each section, there are instructions to guide you on how to correctly complete the section. Inspectors must read each section's instructions completely to ensure that they are completing the form accurately and correctly. On the next few slides, we'll delve into some of the common issues we have seen when reviewing inspection forms. One common issue that we see when we review HQS forms is missing information about the unit. There is some information on the first page that is either not applicable, such as PHA and tenant ID, or not required, such as current street address of the family. But most of the information on the first page is required. As you see on this example, the inspector did not include their name or the date that the inspection was completed. There's also no unit number listed, but you see that they have checked that it is a low-rise. Usually, but not always, a low-rise would have a unit number. If the unit has a unit number, but it is not listed on the form, or the incorrect unit number is listed, the inspection form does not document that the correct unit was inspected. The number of children in the family under 6 must not be left blank. If there are no children under 6, you must write 0 on the line. Still focusing on the first page, we'll now discuss the types of inspection. The inspector must select whether it is an initial or special inspection or a re-inspection. If a unit is being inspected prior to move-in, you will check the initial box. For annual inspections, you will also check the initial box. Do not check the re-inspection or special box when conducting an annual inspection. When a failed item has been repaired and you inspect to verify that the repairs have been made, you will check the re-inspection box. Since you'll be using the same form, it is possible that both the initial and re-inspection boxes will be checked. For inspections such as quality control, move out or vacate, and complaint inspections, you will check the special box. Please keep in mind that when you do a complaint inspection, you only need to inspect the items that were reported. But if you happen to notice additional problems that will cause the unit to fail HQS, they should also be noted, and the responsible party must make the necessary repairs. The documentation must be very clear that it is a special inspection and must describe what the complaint was. This will ensure that it won't be mistaken for an incomplete regular inspection and will document that all issues in the complaint have been investigated. In this example, on the second page, the instructor did not mark it pass or fail. Since the summary decision cannot be made until the entire form is completed, sometimes the inspector forgets to go back and record on the second page whether the unit passed or not. However, without the summary decision being selected, the form does not document compliance. Also missing in this example is the year of construction. As previously mentioned, the year of construction must be completed on this page as there are important lead-based paint requirements for all units built before 1978. Sometimes there is the same number of sleeping rooms as bedrooms, but other times there is a den or a living room that could be used as a sleeping room if certain criteria for windows and electricity are met and documented. We'll talk more about this when we discuss room codes. An efficiency would have 0 for the unit size and 1 for the number of sleeping rooms. The number of bedrooms is what you must use for checking rent reasonableness, and the number of sleeping rooms is what you will look at to verify that there is sufficient space for the household per the acceptability criteria. When assessing whether a deficiency causes a pass or fail determination, refer to the instructions on the form, which provide guidance on determining whether deficiency should result in a fail or a pass with comments. The window and ceiling in this example pass with comments because, while they are not in perfect condition, the defects identified are considered non-hazardous per the instructions. The comments for the wall condition, however, are not descriptive enough to support a pass with comments, as they do not document the severity of the hole. If you note any deficiencies and check pass, the comments must clearly document that the pass determination is correct and consistent with the instructions. If you observe serious defects such as large holes, buckling, bulging, or leaning, you must check the fail box. The comment about the floor condition is another example of comments that are not sufficient to support the pass with comments decision. When people write comments such as clean carpet, it is unclear whether the carpet is clean or needs to be cleaned. In order to meet requirements, there needs to be no ambiguity about the condition of each item. For smoke detectors, you can see that the comment is inconsistent with the pass decision. If a battery-operated smoke detector does not have a battery, or the batteries are dead, this must result in a failed decision for that item. The third question under smoke detectors should be left unanswered if there are no hearing impaired persons occupying the unit. Another error we commonly see is questions about windows being given a fail or being unanswered when there is not a window in specific rooms. As the instructions state, the absence of a window does not result in a fail for window condition in kitchens and bathrooms, although the bathroom will need to have a working vent system to pass the ventilation question if there are no windows. Please note that there must be a window present for a living room or sleeping room to pass. On those pages, the form asks, is there a window present? Each section has lead-based paint visual assessment questions. It is important to carefully assess the condition of painted surfaces and answer the questions correctly. If lead-based paint requirements apply, the visual assessment must be completed. This is a two-part question. First, are all painted surfaces free of deteriorated paint? And second, if no, do deteriorated surfaces exceed 2 square feet and or more than 10% of a component? If the first part is yes, the second part must be left unanswered. In the first incorrect example on this slide, the inspector selected that no deteriorated paint was present and then still answered the question about how much deteriorated paint was present. In the second incorrect example, the inspector answered that no deteriorated paint was present and also selected that lead-based paint requirements are not applicable. If you select the not applicable box, you must include a comment explaining why lead-based paint requirements are not applicable. For example, if the unit was built on or after January 1st, 1978, or it is an SRO. The first correct example is for a unit where lead-based paint requirements are not applicable because the unit was built after January 1st, 1978. This information must be consistent with the year of construction identified on page 2 of the inspection form. The second correct example is how to complete the visual assessment for a unit where lead-based paint requirements are applicable and no deteriorated paint is present. Another two-part question where we see lots of issues is the question about stove or range with oven in the kitchen. The first question asks, is there a working oven and stove or range? The second part of this question begins, if no oven or stove are present. This wording clearly indicates that the second part of this question should not be answered if you check the yes box for the first part of the question. At the top of the page for other rooms used for living in halls, there is a code that the inspector enters to identify the room type. Bedrooms and any other rooms used for sleeping must be identified on the form as room code 1. The number of pages completed as room code 1 must be consistent with the number of bedrooms and sleeping rooms recorded on page 2 of the inspection form. Make sure you also complete the room location section on each page. For an efficiency, the inspector must complete a room code 1 page and note in the description section that the unit is an efficiency. This page feels redundant because most of the questions have already been answered for living room. However, this is where the smoke detector question is. So without completing at least one other rooms used for living and halls page, compliance with the smoke detector requirements would not be documented. In a one-bedroom apartment with a living room used as a sleeping room, you could just fill out a room code 1 page for the bedroom, as all other sleeping requirements for sleeping rooms would be covered. Requirements for electricity and illumination and windows are the same in the living room and the sleeping room. In these situations, we recommend documenting on the living room page that the living room is used as a sleeping room. In order to count any other rooms, for example, a dining room or a den, as a sleeping room, the inspector would need to complete an other rooms used for living in halls page in Part 4 with the room code identified as 1. We strongly recommend that inspectors note what type of room it is. Noting in the description that the room is a dining room or a den is helpful for verifying the correct number of actual bedrooms for rent reasonableness and fair market rent for ESG. Another reason it is important to use the correct room code is because the questions about electricity, illumination, and windows are answered differently for sleeping rooms versus other rooms. Question 4.2 is a two-part question about electricity and illumination. The first part is answered if and only if the room code is a 1. The second part is answered if and only if the room code is not 1. Question 4.5 is a two-part question about window condition. If the room is a code 1, both parts of question 4.5 must be answered. If the room code is anything other than 1, leave the first part of the question blank and answer the second part of the question. You don't need to memorize these rules, just carefully read the questions and respond to them as written. This slide shows an example in which the page for a sleeping room has been filled out correctly on the left, along with an example of how we have seen it completed incorrectly on the right. This slide shows an example in which the page for a dining room that is not a sleeping room has been filled out correctly on the left, along with a common way in which we see it completed incorrectly. Section 5, all secondary rooms, is where the inspector rates rooms not used for living, such as utility rooms and unfinished basements. If none are present in the unit, select none and do not complete the remaining questions in that section. Please do not cross the section out, and make sure that you resume completing the form with Section 6, Building Exterior. In this incorrect example on the left, not only did the inspector leave the box indicating that there are no secondary rooms unanswered, and instead cross it out, they also crossed out part of the section about the building exterior and did not complete it. The example on the right is correct if there are no secondary rooms not regularly used for living. If there are any secondary rooms not used for living, rate all of them together. In other words, complete a single Section 5 checklist for all secondary rooms in the unit. Each of these acceptability requirements is important and must receive careful attention. In this example, the inspector ticked yes in the first box and then just drew a line down the page through all of the other yeses. This is a pretty good indication that the inspector is not carefully examining all of the acceptability criteria and considering whether the unit meets all standards. This is an example of one of the issues that HUD identified in the 2021 monitoring, which led to the finding for our CoC. Question 8.11, which is the last question on the form, discusses correction of deteriorated paint or lead-based paint hazards. As the question states, if the owner was not required to correct any deteriorated paint or lead-based paint hazards, the question should be marked not applicable. We have seen a considerable number of inspection forms where question 8.11 is marked pass. We cannot tell from the form whether pass or not applicable is the correct response. If pass is in fact the correct answer, there is a specific owner certification form which must be signed and present in the participant record. This form is in addition to the lead-based paint disclosure form. If this situation arises, please reach out to strategies for the form. When there are fail or inconclusive items, the initial inspection must clearly identify what repairs are necessary. When conducting a reinspection of failed items, the inspector must write in the right-hand column the date that the reinspection verified that the failed item has been brought into compliance. The decision must be changed from fail to pass. If completing the form by hand, you can simply draw a single line through the fail checkbox and then mark pass. In order for the unit to pass reinspection, each question that failed initial inspection must have the decision changed from fail to pass and the date of final approval in the right-hand column, and the summary decision on page 2 must be changed from fail to pass. As a reminder, non-emergency items must be corrected within 30 days, and emergency items must be repaired within 24 hours. When completing the reinspection form electronically, the documentation will need to reflect both the initial inspection and the reinspection. Adding the date the failed items were corrected without changing the decision from fail to pass will not adequately document that the unit eventually passed. However, changing the decision from fail to pass without also retaining record of the initial inspection decision is also inadequate documentation. When completing re-inspections electronically, we recommend you proceed as follows. Step number 1. Save a separate copy of the initial inspection as the re-inspection, while also keeping a copy of the initial inspection. Number 2. Change from initial to re-inspection on page 1. Enter date of last inspection and current date as the date of inspection. Make sure you untick the initial box so that you don't end up with both the initial and re-inspection boxes selected. Number 3, enter final approval date for each corrected item and change the decision from fail to pass. The fail check will disappear automatically when you select pass. Number 4, if all fail items have been resolved, change the summary decision on page 2 from fail to pass and make sure you untick fail so that you don't end up with both fail and pass selected. If an inspector realizes they have made an error in filling out the form, for example, checking the wrong box or filling out a two-part question incorrectly, it is acceptable to make minor corrections instead of restarting a page or restarting the whole HQS form. To correct an error, simply draw a single line through any incorrect information, making sure the information is still legible but clearly crossed out. Add the correct information where applicable and add your initials and the date that the correction was made very close to the relevant information. Even if the error was corrected on the date the HQS form was completed, make sure you put the date by the inspector's initials. So this completes the portion of the training on the HQS inspection form. As stated earlier, we implore you to carefully read each and every question to ensure that the questions are being answered clearly and correctly. When reviewing inspection forms, we see a significant number of mistakes that could have been avoided by carefully reading the questions. Quite often, the wording of the questions will indicate how or if a question should be answered. We can't anticipate all of the possible errors that may occur in completing this form, but we hope that providing these examples was helpful to you. In addition to the required step of completing an inspection, you may choose to take the additional optional precaution of checking Hamilton County's online system to see if there are any open code violations associated with the property. To do this, go to the URL on this slide and enter the property address in the box at the top. Any information associated with the property will appear in a box in the upper right corner of the map. As you can see, there are several different categories, some of which are probably not relevant to HQS, such as vehicle impound. Click on any category that you want more information on. Here we've clicked on Code Enforcement, which is most likely to have information relevant to HQS. You can see the number of closed and open entries by type, and also the date of the most recent update to each entry. If you click on the type of code enforcement, it will open to provide further detail of each instance. Here, under Code Enforcement, Buildings with Residences, we see that there are 3 entries, all of which are currently closed. Any violation that is still open is a red flag, and even closed violations can indicate an area where you might want to pay extra attention during an inspection. If you click on an entry, it opens up more information. You can click on the inspection timeline or on violations, where you can click on each individual violation for additional information on the specific violation. As I mentioned before, looking up a property in cages is purely optional. The absence of open violations does not mean that the unit meets HQS, but looking in cages can be a useful step in assessing the suitability of a property and may reveal issues that could indicate future HQS problems, such as a plumbing violation that has been patched and is not visibly defective during the inspection, but which has not passed code enforcement reinspection. So that concludes our presentation. Initially, we did not require that each agency adopt this policy. We only required that you have a policy that meets the requirements and assists in operating in compliance with HUD's housing quality standards. However, as a result of the corrective action to the CoC monitoring by HUD in 2021, the HQS has been made a mandatory part of the community policy. Please keep in mind that any staff that will be completing the housing quality inspections or supervising such staff are required to complete the HUD and strategies trainings. Going forward, when the strategies compliance team conducts annual monitorings, we will be checking for the HUD Visual Assessment Certificate of Completion and records documenting completion of this training. So please ensure that the certificates are uploaded to Teams along with the rest of the documents required for the monitoring process. We recognize that these requirements are complex, so please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have questions in the future. Thank you.